Hi everyone, thank you for coming. My name is Jade Ulrich and I'm a Scripps College senior right now, and I'm a TA for FemTechNet. And for the next 40 minutes or so, we're going to be hosting a dialogue discussion between Dr. Adrienne Wadowitz and Professor Jackie Wernimont. So here on my far left, Adrienne Wadowitz is dedicated to exploring how technology can revolutionize the role of women in society. As a feminist, scholar, educator, and digital humanist, she is interested in empowering women by making the sum of all human knowledge available to them in their own language, as well as making them producers of that knowledge. As part of the Wikipedia education program, she introduces Wikipedia into the classroom, and as an editor, she writes about 18th century female authors. And here, right to my near left, is Jackie Wernimont. She is an assistant professor of English at Scripps College. She teaches in feminist, gender and sexuality studies, media studies, and science, technology, and society as well. She holds a PhD and MA in English literature from Brown University and a BA with honors in English literature from the University of Iowa, where she also studied molecular biology. Jackie's scholarly interests include digital humanities, the role of the academic in the public sphere, and historical relationships between number and poetry. Last year, she hosted the first That Camp Feminisms at Scripps College and has a forthcoming co-authored piece on genre expectations and citation practices in Wikipedia. We will be discussing the keyword dialogue of Wikistorm. And yes, thank you guys so much for being here, and we'll just get started. The first question I have is, how do you position Wikistorm, the keyword, in relationship to feminism and technology?
Okay. So I generally think about Wikistorming in relation to the larger conversation that we're having in our culture right now about women and the sort of technology-based professions. So if you think about the problems that women have had entering computer science as of late, or technology professions, and the sort of programmer culture that exists in Silicon Valley, for example, I think about the larger program of getting women to contribute to Wikipedia and sort of revolutionizing the culture that's inside Wikipedia that the Wikistorming project is a part of, as part of that larger conversation.
And for me, a lot of it is about the sort of long history of knowledge work and the gendering of that long history. So the ways in which certain kinds of authority structures, certain kinds of knowledge paradigms are in fact gendered. And thinking about not only women's participation in those knowledge systems, but also how we might think about what a feminist approach to those knowledge systems might look like. So a kind of back and forth between changing the community as it exists by increasing the role of women, but also changing the goals of the community by thinking about particular kinds of feminist interventions.
Can you tell us about your intellectual path and how you end up thinking about these ideas that you just talked about?
So for me, because I identify both strongly as a Wikipedian and as an academic, these are sort of dual identities that I hold, sometimes very much in tension. What got me most interested in thinking about how feminism can change and alter Wikipedia is myself. I first started out editing Wikipedia with an anonymous username, and nobody really commented much about what I was editing in terms of my gender at all. But then when I used my real name on the encyclopedia and I said, hey, this is who I am, because I was using it more for professional reasons, all of a sudden there was a lot of commentary. Oh, you're a woman, or you can't really be a woman, or you don't write like a woman, or all of a sudden the arguments I was making were not taken as seriously and were sort of judged to be hysterical or emotional, which are sort of typical stereotypes, right, that are sort of have a long history.
They have a very long
history. They have a very long history. And so I got much more interested in, well, why was this suddenly happening? It had never happened before, right? And it seemed like there was suddenly a very masculinized space that I was in that I had not really personally experienced as being so masculinized. And so that's when I really started to do a lot of gender outreach and a lot of research into why exactly was this happening and why was this space so different from the way I had even perceived it before myself, personally.
And I think one of the things for me, I'm an early modern scholar, so I work on mostly the 16th and 17th century, shading into the 18th century. So I'm very interested in that long history of women's anonymous work in certain kinds of genres, but also the reaction to women's work when they attempt to sort of unmask, as Adrienne is talking about, right? Or to be sort of upfront about the fact that they are women producing knowledge. I'm also, because I'm interested in how both digital and analog technologies represent knowledge, that is how they can shape what it's even possible to know. I'm particularly interested in thinking about the long history of Wikipedia as a genre, right? So it's a tertiary resource. You can think about it as an encyclopedia. That's in fact how Wikipedia itself sort of thinks of itself, a free encyclopedia that anybody can edit. And that genre has a very long history. And so as a literary historian, that's the kind of thing that I'm sort of interested in, is how do the genre expectations around encyclopedias shape the way that people produce knowledge and consume knowledge in Wikipedia, but also how Wikipedia as something that is much more crowdsourced, right? And not print-based, right? I mean, it's dependent on print in many ways for citation and evidence, for example, but it exists in digital media, and thinking about how that difference changes its function in society as an encyclopedia. That's sort of how I've come to the project, as a person interested in that long history.
I think this point that you raise about women being anonymous writers, I studied the 18th century, and women were definitely anonymous writers in the 18th century as well. But there are also kinds of writing that women are allowed to do. And what was particularly interesting in the 18th century is that women were allowed to do a lot of writing for children. And so men who wanted to write for children often would use women's names to publish, because that made their writing more legitimate, because that was what was allowed. And there are actually children's encyclopedias from the 18th century that have anonymous names, but they were written by men, even though those names are women's names. So it's so if you're talking about the long history of what is an encyclopedia, it's all wrapped up with this notion of what legitimates the information that goes into it. And there's a very complicated gendered history behind that. And who the audience of that encyclopedia is. So if you're writing for a specific audience, for example, children, it often is, oh, it's okay if it's a woman is writing that. And actually it would be better if a woman were writing that. But if you're writing an encyclopedia that's supposed to be for everyone, it's almost like everyone is default a man or a white man, and therefore it must also be a white man who's writing that.
Thinking about the children's encyclopedia raises another set of issues, which is like, what kinds of authority is Wikipedia attempting to produce? What kinds of knowledge is it attempting to produce? And I think for me, among the questions that is interesting or issues that are interesting are the debates that are happening right now in Wikipedia. So Adrienne was just recently telling me about, early on in Wikipedia's formation, there were questions about who could edit, right? Could anyone edit, or could only certain people edit, right? A certain kind of gatekeeping function. And they decided not to do that, largely. And that discussion has been raised again, partly in response to the activities of students who are working in Wikipedia, right? And so that it's become a revived conversation about who is authorized to produce knowledge, but also what kinds of knowledge are particular people authorized to produce. And I think not only is that a gendered question, but it's a class and race question, right? That there are really significant ways in which that stratifies that are worth thinking about.
What are the recent projects that you've been working on in relation to Wikistorming in particular?
There are several here that are worth talking about. One is I do a lot of advising for faculty and students who are trying to contribute to Wikipedia. I sort of think of myself as the Google Translate between academia and Wikipedia, because a lot of Wikipedians don't understand academia, and a lot of academics see Wikipedia as this like foreign world, right, that they're trying to enter, and they need some sort of guidebook, right? So I am that sort of bridge between the two for a lot of groups of people. So I spend a lot of time doing that, sort of providing advice about how to sort of enter this foreign land, right? I'm a little guidebook, right? Ask me anything about it. But also I do research about Wikipedia to try to understand how it shapes our understanding of information, because it's not presenting information in an objective way. There's right? No sort of objective way to present, for example, a history of the French Revolution. There are going to be narratives that you can choose to tell, and things are going to get left out. So I've been working on trying to understand which sources and which kinds of sources are used the most in Wikipedia history articles, whether there's actually a trend of trying to tell a narrative about the kinds of history that's been told. So for example, is there an understanding amongst Wikipedia editors that you need to tell the history of the history, right? That you can say, look, there used to be, story A about the French Revolution. Now there's story B, now there's story C, now there's story D. Or are they actually just going to tell one narrative as if there's one fact about what happened in the French Revolution? So trying to actually find a way to ask those questions quantitatively across thousands of articles is a challenge, because you can read one article and figure out whether they succeeded or failed in that, but to see whether or not that's a trend across the encyclopedia is a difficult question to ask. So that's something that I've been trying to work on, to figure out whether there's that historical awareness, or what we would call historiographical awareness, amongst Wikipedia editors.
And we've been thinking a little bit together in the context of the Doc 13 about how to potentially measure impact or success in various classes, right? If there's this conversation about the usefulness to both the Wikipedia community and to the Wikipedia user community of students editing, and one of the things that we can do to be helpful in that conversation is to actually be able to measure success. And I think that's also a pedagogical effort, right? Being able to feed back to the instructors about what was successful and what wasn't from a number of different perspectives. So we've been doing that in the context of the FemTechNet effort. I've also been working on a piece with Moya Bailey, this is the thing that's coming out, thinking about how genre expectations in Wikipedia operate and how citational practices operate and the ways in which they might reproduce certain kinds of privilege and thinking about how we might imagine that what was initially a very modern, Western, largely male-dominated genre, the encyclopedia, might actually function usefully for global postmodern audiences, which I think is a very significant challenge with respect to a kind of genre shift from the encyclopedia to Wikipedia.
Actually, I think this question about student success in Wikipedia is very important to think about, because a lot of times we think about success in very small terms, right? In terms of how many words were added to an article or how many articles were created in general, because these are things that are easy to measure. It's much harder to measure the fact that students, for example, gained an understanding of the fact that knowledge itself is a constructed entity, or the fact that it's unreliable and they actually have to look at other sources with a critical eye. How you measure that is incredibly difficult. And it would also appear from discussions that have occurred many times on Wikipedia that Wikipedians themselves do not care if students learn that. Which is a disturbing trend, in my opinion. I mean, as a Wikipedian, that makes me very, very unhappy. And I think that Wikipedians should care whether students learn that or not. But they seemingly don't. So it's a really fascinating thing to think about. What does it mean for a student to have a successful interaction with Wikipedia? Does it mean that they added content that stayed there for 5 years? Does it mean that even if their content was taken down, they now understand the fact that there's a dialogue that takes place around information, and you actually sometimes have to fight for information to remain in the public sphere so that other people know about it? That's a learning moment that I've seen many students have, but their information is no longer there, but they still had that learning moment. So I feel like there's a lot of ways to measure student success, and some are easier than others.
Yeah. And I think, in context of the keyword, right, wiki storming, and thinking about a kind of cultural change within Wikipedia, there's the other side that is perhaps harder yet to assess because we have very little control over that, and that is how much our perceptions changed, tolerances shifted, ideas altered within the Wikipedia community, right? Whether or not students stay as perpetual editors, right? Because as we know, new editors often do not remain for long periods of time, whether they're students or not. And so thinking about how you might even judge impact within the Wikipedia community, I think is an additional question that we have yet to come up with a satisfactory answer for, but is worth thinking about.
It's an important one because even if you add a lot of new content with the idea of, oh, I want to change the focus of Wikipedia because there are a lot of articles missing about women or women's history or something along those lines, if you aren't changing the people who are there, then fundamentally it's not going to matter because those people will rewrite articles and shape the policies that that determine what kind of information can get into the encyclopedia. And there are very few of those people, and so they're incredibly powerful. There's only about 1,000 who shape Wikipedia as it is. 1,000 people. 1,000 people who shape, I mean, I can't get over how small a number that is, who shape what sort of everybody in the world reads. There are 100,000 Wikipedia editors, but there are 1,000 active editors, and active means that you edit more than 4 times a month. So imagine the people who actually edit every day, the small number that is. It's exceptionally small.
And that makes that a hard community to change, right, or to move, right? Because I think one of the other things that I know you and I have talked about is the question of labor, right, and what it means that Wikipedia is the sort of is a source, not the source, but a source of knowledge for a global community, right? But it's based on volunteer labor and the kinds of work that isn't being done because people are doing that work, or the kinds of time that people can put in, right? Whether or not, academics like any of us or any of you as students are able to invest the time to edit 4 times a month in order to be one of those editors who's really shaping things is a real issue, I think.
So yeah, the people who have the most time to edit and who do in fact edit Wikipedia the most, who we found out from surveys, are college students because they have access to information that can be put in to Wikipedia and they have the time. And second to that would be teenagers because they have lots of time. And then are people who are retired.
Yeah.
So there's this big gap in the middle where people who have careers and people who are building families, for example, people who are married and have children are like the lowest demographic on Wikipedia because they simply run out of time to do anything. They have to make dinner, they have to put their kids to bed, they have to take their kids to school, and all of these things just eat up time. And so there are huge demographics that are missing from Wikipedia. It's not just women who are missing. There are all these other sort of things to keep in mind. Right, which means that there are large areas of content that are skewed or underrepresented as well.
What is one key question for the future in regard to wiki-storming and Wikipedia?
For me, it's this question of sustainability. And it goes back to this question of labor. There really is a small pool of people who can voluntarily give up free time for an encyclopedia where they're not getting paid anything. And whether or not there should be paid editing is a very controversial question within Wikipedia. And that we've pretty much sort of tapped out those numbers of people who are so excited to go to the library and do research and put that information freely available onto the internet. We peaked in about 2007, 2008 of having new editors, and that number has declined ever since then. So we're not replacing editors who leave with the same numbers of new people who come. And that's a significant problem for the Wikipedia community. So it could just keep decreasing, and then there aren't people to maintain the articles, there aren't people to write new articles, and it could just sort of disintegrate and deteriorate. And how long that would take, nobody really knows. There's been a sort of a large discussion within the Wikipedia community, what do we do about this? So that's why there have been multiple kinds of outreach programs to sort of fix that problem. But it hasn't been very successful, honestly. And part of it is because of this labor question. So for me, as a Wikipedian, that's a huge problem, right? Because I want there to be this free source of information. And so getting more people to edit is like the number one problem.
I think for me, there was a question raised earlier this year by Alan Liu on Twitter, and other people, David Golumbia and others, have talked about this, and that's the possibility of digital citation, right? So Wikipedia as a tertiary resource depends heavily, not exclusively, because there have been conversations about this, but depends heavily on print sources, right? So if it's not in print, it's very difficult to get it into Wikipedia, both because of notability requirements, but also because of citational practices, right? And I think thinking about, as we move into an era where more and more publication happens in the digital sphere, what it means to depend on print sources over digital sources, I think is a really critical question for the ongoing viability of something like Wikipedia. I think there's also a question about the differences and maybe the synergies or the kind of Venn diagram overlap between what Liu has called academic knowledge and Web 2.0 knowledge. And he is sort of interested in distinguishing between public intellectual knowledge production and what happens in the academy, and thinking about those as having two different perspectives with respect to audience, with respect to citational practices, with respect to evidence, et cetera. And I think I'm very interested in thinking more about how that distinction might be problematic, right, between academic knowledge and Web 2.0 knowledge, and where Wikipedia might offer us some insight in that. But also thinking about where things like authority and agency become meaningful to us, right? Because it seems to me that part of what's at stake in his distinction between those two kinds of knowledge is different senses of authority and different senses of agency. And I think those are really critical for thinking about how we want knowledge to be produced in the 21st century.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's actually less useful to think of it as a print-online distinction, as something rather than more something like a peer-reviewed or vetted distinction, because in the sort of citational rules on Wikipedia, it's not about where it's published, it's all about sort of what kind of vetting or fact-checking process things go through, which is why there's such a gray area around things like blogs,
Right.
because there is generally, for a blog, no fact-checking process, right? So like there are wonderful blogs on the New York Times, but they aren't fact-checked the way that New York Times articles are, which most people are actually completely unaware of. But so the question becomes, with blogs written by experts, should you be able to use those because they're written by an expert and therefore there is some authority and legitimacy behind them? That's a very real live question that's sort of constantly raised on Wikipedia. Oh, but this was written by, Nate Silver in his blog on the New York Times, and he's an expert when it comes to statistics and elections, so therefore we should be able to rely on his blog. But then other people respond by saying, but just because somebody's an expert doesn't mean that there doesn't need to be someone who's looking over what they're saying. So that's the sort of discussion that I feel that goes back and forth, and not about necessarily whether it's in print or not, but about whether there's been this process of discussion around the text before it's been published.
Which is interesting, right? Because I think it goes back to the question of authority,
Yeah.
right? Like how is authority constructed, right? How does something become an authoritative source,
Yeah.
right? And using that model of peer review, fact checking slightly different, right? Because that's a journalistic model, but that's very much in the realm of academic knowledge work, right? And thinking about who is and isn't excluded from that, I think is interesting, right? Because there are certain institutional structures that make things like fact checking and vetting and peer review possible, and certain communities are not able to access those structures in the same way. So
That's
that
absolutely
changes
right.
things.
And there's a certain kind of, say, research that you can't get done because you can't submit it to a peer-reviewed journal because it's not fashionable at the time, for example, so therefore it's not going to get published, right? And that doesn't mean it's not good research. And so what if you put it on your blog, but you're a professor who got published doing X, but you now put it on your blog and it's about Y? Does that mean that you can count it as an authoritative source? Right. These are very real questions,
How do you see traditional academic work intersecting with public intellectual labor such as Wikipedia? I know we've touched on this briefly.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like what scholars do is fundamentally what you do as a Wikipedia editor. You do research, you write, and you publish. That's essentially what you're doing as a Wikipedia editor when you're writing an article. Scholars also do something that's fundamentally different, which is they're doing original research. They're trying to publish something new that no one has ever published before. But you don't publish in a vacuum. And everything you publish also refers to other people's work and explains, in the context of all of this work that has come before, here's where my idea fits. And it's that contextual work that is similar. It's not exactly the same as an encyclopedia article, but it's similar to that, because you're always having to explain other people's ideas to make your ideas clearer. And that's essentially what you're doing in encyclopedias. You're saying, hey, let's explain all these ideas to people who don't know them. So I feel that there's a very strong similarity between what scholars do and what Wikipedia is trying to do. I wish more scholars would realize that, would realize that, there are many people who are interested in what they know, that actually, they're not speaking to 5 people or 10 people like they sometimes think they are, that there is a wider audience for what they know. And if they translate it a little bit, out of academic jargon, lots of people want to read it. Thousands of people will come and read these articles.
And I think, the question about who's being reached, right? What audiences are we speaking to is a really interesting one. And I think, there's a tension. There are certain structures in place that make formal academic work part of our jobs, right? Whereas the Wikipedia work remains something like volunteer work, as with anything, right? And I think trying to understand how that kind of communication to other audiences, how that kind of civic engagement in knowledge production might actually be a real benefit to institutions is an interesting thing to think more about. I also, going back to your observation about, should Wikipedia record the history of a question, right? Thinking about the French Revolution. I think for me, it's fascinating that these questions about public knowledge and what in the 17th century and later in the 18th century was sort of known as scientific knowledge, right? That is, who was part of the scientific academies, who had the right to produce knowledge, who was in an institution. That these conversations have been going on for an extraordinarily long time, right? What counts as good enough knowledge in different spheres? And I think there's an interesting opportunity in the conversations around Wikipedia, because there's so much public and academic interest in it, to revisit some of those very long-held discussions and think about how we might want to move in directions other than where we've been thus far, right? That maybe that distinction deserves a little blurring, right? So that it's about voice and recognizing audience, not about communities of communication, right? That in fact you're trying to communicate with larger communities that are more inclusive, more diverse, et cetera, but that you recognize that it takes different voices to speak, or different registers at different times.
Well, and I feel like the technology itself enables you to have various experiments, because you can change things so quickly, and you can say, well, let's try it. Let's try this first experiment X. Let's see what happens. Okay, we didn't like that. Let's try Y. And you can just keep changing it in different iterations. Whereas it's much more difficult when you're publishing a book. You have one go. You have one way to try your presentation to your audience. But that's not the case on Wikipedia. We can change anything we want. Anytime. We can change the structure of it. We can change how you edit it. We can change how the articles look. We can change anything we want. We can change the rules anytime we want to do that. Whole sets of the rules have been changed. So like, for example, before 2004, you never had to add citations for anything. So there was a moment where people decided, hey, we can't just put in whatever we think as editors. That's not working out. So there was a moment where that was instituted. Yeah. So it's an important thing to realize that there's actually this history of Wikipedia, right, changing as a thing itself, and that reveals that, like, we can change it. Right? So they're also implementing a visual editor so that you can edit it like you would edit Microsoft Word, so you don't have to learn any code, because that's been a barrier to a lot of people editing it. So it's a fundamentally different way of interacting with the program.
Yeah. And I think thinking about a technology that communally morphs is very interesting, right? And thinking about that as both a public entity, but also as an academic structure is interesting to me. I don't know where I would go with that necessarily, but the kind of fungibility of it to me seems like a rich site of possibility.
Yeah, I agree.
Great. Well, thank you so much. And I'd like to open it up to the audience. I know some of you must have some questions. Feel free to just raise your hand and
Go, Alex, go.
I have a whole bunch of questions, but so if someone doesn't come behind me, I'll ask another one. But I guess the first is off topic, but not, or it's a two-part question. There was a lot of debate on the internet among feminists about the word wikistorming and the legacy of it as, you know, the kind of the genealogy of that term. And I'm wondering if either of you want to sort of explain your feeling about that, but maybe even a little of that history for people who don't know. An internal debate among feminists about that?
Right, so as I understand it, part of the discussion was about the militaristic quality of that term, right, wikistorming, and whether or not that kind of assault language was what we wanted to use in the context of feminist interventions. And, you know, for some people, it felt like that was inappropriate language because of not necessarily because of its aggressiveness, but because of its sort of being wrapped up in the military-industrial complex and that long history of violences, right? And for other people, that felt very appropriate, right? As a feminist intervention that said, no, actually, like there are structures in place that we want to challenge and that deserve challenge, right? Because they have themselves perpetuated certain kinds of exclusions that are themselves violent, right? That it has been a hostile space or an unwelcoming space. It is a space that has been exclusionary, and therefore it needs a kind of assault on the walls, as it were. You know, I, as a literary scholar, am sensitive to words. You know, so I don't want to discredit the importance of naming, right? I think that's significant. I certainly wouldn't throw that away. That said, I personally am not uncomfortable with it because I do think that there are times when aggressive calls to action and aggressive attempts to change are merited, right? At the same time, I will say that one of the things that I know was part of the pushback from the Wikipedia community was this sense of like, who the heck are these people who are like climbing the metaphorical walls and coming into our community? And I do think that one of the most important things about Wikistorming or editathon efforts, whatever you want to name them, is that you can't, it is very difficult to offer a cogent critique without understanding the community, right? And you can't understand the community without participating in it. And I think that participation has to be sincere. And so if the assaultive language is seen as not taking seriously the community and the culture of Wikipedia, then I think that would be a problem. But that's not how I've understood it. I've understood it much more as let's send out people, right, to become part of this community. And I think that's quite appropriate. And if that feels like infiltration, if people are working within that community, within the rules of the community and trying to affect change, then I'm comfortable with that.
Yeah, I have to say, I was really torn by that word just myself because I sort of consider myself an activist. I do a lot of those kinds of activist type things like leading protests and things like that, right? And so that part of me was like, this is awesome. I love this word. You know what I mean? Like, this is great because it announces very much that sort of, you know, in your face, I'm here, you know, this is what I stand for, this is what I'm going to do. But the Wikipedia part of me was like, this is a disaster. Like, I knew exactly what was going to happen by using that word because the Wikipedia community was going to see it. No one was going to see it as assault language. That was never going to happen. Nobody cared about that at all because they're not going to read it through the lens of a literary critic. What they were going to see was a group of people who had no experience with Wikipedia saying, this is what should happen in your community, and I know better what should happen in your community than you who have been there for a decade. And that is indeed exactly what happened. I mean, I got lots of emails from my friends on Wikipedia saying, why did you let this happen? As if like I have some sort of authoritative control over what happens, you know, with these things. But it was really interesting because I could predict that that's exactly what would happen. You know, they felt very personally attacked, right? Whereas it's not a personal attack on anyone, right? But that's exactly what happens in what is a small-ish community, right? Is that people feel personally attacked when you say there's a systemic problem here, right? And we can all fix the systemic problem by doing small things, right? And here are the small things that you can do, but it is not you personally, right? I mean, yes, there are there are individual Wikipedians who do bad things, but that's just not generally the issue, That's not what we were doing. We're not calling out individual Wikipedians, right? That's not the issue. But that's generally how it felt, right, to Wikipedians, that, we're going to come in and we're going to tag everybody on their user page somehow, right, who's a misogynist, right? That's exactly what I think, how they felt that was going to happen.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, to me, that was, internally, I even had that debate, right? I was like,
Well, I think, there are real questions about the community politics of that kind of terminology, right? And what it does in terms of ingratiating a group of people to an existing community. And that's probably its biggest downfall, I think, is the walls that it immediately threw up amongst the community. I mean, that said, when we did the edit-a-thon here, the people who run the Tea House, right?
Yeah.
The Wikipedia editors who are sort of proactively attempting to support new editors, especially women editors, although also feminist editors, right? Reached out in very generous ways, right? And were very supportive. And I've had nothing but very positive engagements, despite being associated, right, with this relatively aggressive term.
Right, yeah, exactly. So I think it also just kind of depends where you are on the encyclopedia and what you're editing. So I know that there are students who have been involved in projects where there have been editing articles on Islam and have had some pretty negative consequences. But part of that is just because those are very controversial articles right now. You know what I mean? So it's kind of topic-based. You can run into some excellent Wikipedians editing various topics, but you can also run into problems because of the nature of the topic. So that it all sort of comes down to that too, all these caveats.
I guess the follow-up on that question was the way that some of the right-wing press understood that term. And so again, like terms are specific within receiving communities as well. And I wonder if either of you wanted to reflect upon or answer some of the fears that more conservative members of our society had in relationship to feminists wiki-storming. And, is there merit to those fears? What was their interpretation of that term? How would you respond to that?
Well, I mean, I know in thinking about, so there were concerns, right, that what was going to happen with a feminist wiki storming was that all of the content was suddenly going to be made radically liberal, right, in its ideology. And that, in some ways, I think, as you pointed out in some of the discussions, is not even possible, in part because of the neutrality mandate within Wikipedia, right? So there is a certain way in which content is produced and vetted that makes it such that those fears were always hyperbolic, right? That was a way of caricaturing the work that was being done. And I think it really demonstrated a very serious misunderstanding on the part of those right-wing outlets about the nature of Wikipedia, right? And so I think, in some ways it seemed like they missed the point entirely, right? And that it was really what they were reacting to was feminist anywhere.
Because there was one article I remember that was saying, we should have our own group and go add in our own, as if, I don't know if you know about Conservapedia, but it's sort of a copy of Wikipedia, but actually everything is from a very specific point of view, and it's from a sort of American right-wing point of view, hence the name Conservapedia. And that's basically what they want to create, is what the sort of article was talking about, is they want to create everything from their own sort of ideological standpoint, which is not what we were doing. The thing that interested me more about those articles, actually, was that it was emphasizing that feminist scholars were giving college credit for having their students edit. And that was the thing that they sort of repeated over and over and over again. These feminists are giving credit for editing Wikipedia, because it's a very non-traditional assignment, right? So it's joining together these two horrid things, right? Feminism, which is terrible on one side, and then they're not doing real work, right? These students are not doing real work. They're not reading real books and writing real papers, right? You could see this whole sort of thing, the decline of education, the decline of American civilization, right? It all comes about because feminists are on the internet, right? I mean, I could just see this whole narrative, right? Like playing out. And part of it was because of that, right? This sort of fluffy thing, this fluffiness to it, right?
I think there was also a concern that it was coercive, right?
Yeah.
That insofar as it was built into syllabi, right, that would then force students to do something.
Well, force them to become feminists. That,
Exactly, right?
Yeah,
The
yeah.
fear of all fears, that you would publicly then be transformed into a feminist live on the internet.
Right.
Instead of really understanding the ways in which those assignments were deeply about understanding the culture of a technology that is central, right, in many of our communities, right? And that work itself required that kind of engagement, that kind of critical making, right, if you will. And a failure to understand, I think the way that Wikipedia works such that doing an assignment on Wikipedia does not make you a feminist, right? Like, there are lots of ways to write on Wikipedia, as evidenced by large bodies of work, that are not themselves feminist, right? And so there were certain kinds of assumptions being made about, not only like the lack of potential rigor, right, but the possible, the obverse, right, that this might be coercive in a very dangerous way, which I think is unfounded.
Any students?
So there was, we're talking about what legitimizes the information that goes onto Wikipedia, and then there was also some discussion about how, since it's unpaid labor that you're putting into Wikipedia, how that affects who accesses this labor. And then I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit more on the relationship overall that Wikipedia has had to capital, so including like having to have your printed sources, having to have those kind of things, and how that power is kind of related to
I think, Adrian's point about, not necessarily book-bound or print sources, right, but vetted sources, does mean, that you have to have access to certain kinds of knowledge centers, right? So whether that's, books in a library or subscriptions through an institutional library like many college students would have, I think there are avenues for accessing knowledge that are wrapped up in fiscal resources, right, and certain kinds of privilege. And I think that that does impact the kind of knowledge that can be represented there. Are there other?
Well, I would say that really points to your discussion about class, right? Because you're talking about people who have access to a very good university system, actually. It has to be a good university system which has access to databases like JSTOR and MLA and EBSCO, and a lot of them, and not just one little one. That's the thing, is that I've actually provided a lot of my friends on Wikipedia with copies of articles that they found cited in Google Scholar but don't have access to themselves because they're no longer at a university or college, or they live in a country where they simply can't get access to them. And so because I have access to them, send them this stuff all the time. Now, Wikipedia has tried to make partnerships with some of these database companies, for example, JSTOR, to grant like the 100 most active Wikipedians a free JSTOR account or something like that, so that they are trying to deal with that issue. But you don't become an active Wikipedian unless you already have access to that information and know how to read it. That's the other thing that's really crucial, is that you're talking about reading academic articles in JSTOR. You have to go to school a long time to be able to read that article, or have a significant amount of free time away from your job to learn how to read an academic article. Science articles in PubMed, for example, are even harder. The number of people who can read those articles and summarize them for the public is incredibly small. So figuring out how to either find more people who can do that or give them more time so that they can do that is I feel, a tough problem, a tough problem to solve.
I would also say, there have been several initiatives that have been much lauded in the press, right, to make things like Wikipedia available on mobile devices, particularly in the Global South. And this is heralded as giving people access to knowledge. And I think there are a number of different problems with those claims, but one of the problems is that those mobile devices require bandwidth, right, or data minutes, right? And so while there's access, there isn't necessarily the money to pay for those data minutes, and that's a real problem, right? But even more than that, I think perhaps, is that those kinds of relatively lightweight mobile applications do not usually support editing in the same way, right? And so then what you have is the push out of certain kinds of knowledge resources to certain communities without the reciprocal ability to transform or make that knowledge themselves. And I think that's actually deeply problematic and clearly tied to flows of capital, flows of knowledge in a kind of global context that really deserves
I think a
more
great example of
scrutiny.
what you're talking about is the fact that for a long time, and I think still, they are installing a copy of Wikipedia on every laptop for one laptop per child. And that's the key to remember there is it's a copy of it's a snapshot of Wikipedia at one moment in time, because they can't guarantee that whoever gets the laptop is going to have access to the internet. So they have this, Wikipedia is a constant evolving thing. You're not supposed to have really a downloaded copy of it. But it's freely available, it's cheaper. Encyclopedia Britannica is apparently not donating itself to one laptop per child. So Wikipedia is, and that's what you get, but it's very incomplete.
Yeah.
And there are inaccuracies, lots of them. And the whole point is that you're supposed to be able to add to it, but you can't in that context. So that population is being very underserved in that context.
Well, I just wanted to say thank you to Adrienne and Jackie, and FemTechNet is lucky to have you guys talk about wiki storming, and yeah.
Can you do a round of applause?